Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.
It's a pleasure to be with you again. You have come out to get the final chapter that I'll be able to share here at camp meeting. But I'll tell you, it's not the final chapter because there are still so many more personalities and devotional practices that can be researched. So I hope this will whet your appetite so you will continue in your quest to understand our church history and what we can learn from those who also walk closely with God. I hope that in your hand, or it's coming to you very soon, you will have a handout, because we actually have the pleasure of covering two personalities in this one 60-minute session. Don't worry, as you receive a handout that is twice as long, I am fully aware that I have 60 minutes in which to have your attention before I must share it again. But this evening we are going to look first at a man by the name of James White. He is an individual who seems larger than life, and so many of these loom larger than life. But the first question I ask you is, how do you view your finances? How can you use the finances that you've been gifted with to further the work of God while also caring for your family's personal needs? Today we continue with our spiritual practices of Adventist pioneers with a look at stewardship and James White and the example that he set. The question is, how do we use the resources we've been entrusted with? How do we use them intelligently, wisely, and in keeping with what God would have us do? James White served as leader and financial architect to the fledgling Seventh-day Adventist denomination right from the beginning. Many scholars put forward that the three founders of our church, Joseph Bates, James White, Ellen White. Now you get to picture and meet the third. During his leadership time, he established a medical institution, a publishing house, a college, and a church structure. I think any one of those could be the work of a lifetime to set it up well, to make it have a structure that continue to expand and grow as our church system has expanded around the world, all based off of the work that James White originally put into place. During this time, he initiated, according to Mr. Wheeler, who wrote a biography of James White, he initiated almost everything that is the Seventh-day Adventist Church today. From church organization to publishing to education, health, and the church's worldwide mission, he was involved in the first stages of almost every major project, either as initiator or major participant during his time as a leader of our church. And if that doesn't make you tired just trying to wrap your mind around everything he did, I should read it again so you could understand the breadth of influence that this man had on our church structure and what we are indebted to him for even at this current time. Because it is said we are standing on the shoulders of those who went before us, and especially is the case when we look at James White. From an early age, James White determined to be financially independent. His parents instilled this in him, and preaching didn't pay too well, so he needed some side work in order to stretch the budget, in order to reach his goal of financial independence. So he asked a wealthy farmer to hire him to mow hay. Now, this didn't mean grabbing a key and climbing up on a tractor and mowing hay. It meant what's in your picture right now. This was his mechanism of mowing hay, a scythe. Some of you have used them, and you can I have never personally used one. I have seen them used, and I am impressed with the energy and ability that it takes to cut evenly and effectively with a scythe. I'm so dependent on machines. That's the first thing I thought when I was reading the story. Well, he went out to mow hay. What does that mean? Keep reading and look at the picture. And so I kept reading and I learned this. There were other workers that were hired at the same time, and they learned that James White was a preacher. They were not impressed. They didn't feel like preachers had a good work ethic, and so they were going to show James White up so that he would get discouraged and leave. So what did they do? They volunteered James to lead the way as they went down the row, and that they would come up behind him and get what he missed. Well, Putting their heads together, this is the plan that they hatched. They wanted to make it difficult for James, so hard that he would quit. He asked him, lead the pack, and you mow across the field, and we'll come behind you. And they decided they would drive at a pace behind him to crowd him out. Well, James agreed to lead. He proceeded to pick up his scythe, cutting a wide swath as he went. And with every swing of the scythe, James was sending up a prayer to heaven for physical strength. That prayer was answered because the group quickly found out they couldn't keep up. They cut narrow and narrower swaths trying to keep up with him, and they finally gave up and admitted defeat, confessing their plot to James White. When they admitted it, what kind of conversation do you think they had? James White is a preacher, and you give an opening. I don't have a transcript of it. I can only imagine that this initiated a conversation about his Savior, Jesus Christ. This commitment to prayer and hard work showed as he traveled widely to preach the gospel. Described by those who knew him, they said he was a serious and earnest Christian. A child pointed out that he was not always solemn, though, as this picture makes him appear very solemn. This child in a letter she wrote, she added his preaching style made it easy to remember his instruction. And apparently James White was a very energetic preacher. According to one story, the popular young preacher was featured at a camp meeting where a huge downpour hit. Picture Monday here at Camp White Sand. What was their solution? Well, the solution, his suggestion, was to sing until the noise of the storm passed and they could hear him again. Would have been appropriate if we were doing this on Monday and we chose to sing. So they sang and sang. Soon, the storm passed and James resumed his sermon. He was so completely absorbed in his message that he walked right off the front of the stage without missing a beat. There were people who thought that it was just part of what was planned because he tucked, rolled, and kept preaching without missing a beat. He then climbed right back up on the platform, preaching the whole time. In fact, he built it in so well, they thought that he planned it. You see, James White grew up with a teacher, father, a voice teacher, father. And James White incorporated music into every part of his life. A friend, Elder W.A. Spicer, recalls in a letter, I remember well as a boy sitting in our church waiting for the preacher. Our backs were to the street door through which the minister would enter. Then suddenly the silence would be broken by a sweetly musical and strong, sure voice singing a familiar hymn. I can see the singer now, James White, silver-haired, coming down the aisle, beating time on his Bible and singing. By the time he finished the first stanza and the chorus, the congregation was caught and carried along in the Spirit and was joining in. James White recognized the value of music in Christian life, and he also saw it as a business opportunity. This led him to publish 5 hymnals and 4 supplemental hymnals between the years of 1849 and 1861. His entrepreneur spirit showed up. James met his match and speaker. Do you know her name? His wife. She was Ellen Harmon when he met her, and very soon after, she was Ellen White. They married, combined their efforts, and as I mentioned before, that their favorite message, their united efforts drew crowds eager to hear their favorite messages. The wonders of redemption, the position and work of Christ as one with the Father in creation, and in all the dispensations pertaining to the plan of salvation, and finally, the glories of his coming restitution. This is how Uriah Smith, another church leader, described them. I like their favorite themes. I think I could listen to a few sermons with those themes, be encouraged and motivated to follow my Savior. They traveled extensively, using the most modern methods available to them, horseback, train, and foot. During this time, the first transcontinental railroad completed its track length of 1,776 miles in 1869, making their travel much easier, but not as easy as we have it today. You see, James White knew from personal experience the effort it took as a preacher to support a family financially. As the Seventh-day Adventist Church grew, one of the growing pains centered on paying the clergy. How do we pay those who are leading out in the work? What does it look like? Several energetic and called preachers left the work to return to farming or carpentry because they could not sustain the needs of their family based off of what they were paid. Among them was a man by the name of John N. Andrews. He retired from pastoral work in his mid-20s to work as a clerk in his father's store. The reason? There was no money to support his family. And James and Ellen White saw this as a challenge, and it was heavy on their heart. They saw the gifts of preachers like John J. N. Andrews, and they wanted to be able to put them back to work. After working with a committee to create a plan, White gladly announced their findings. It was called Systematic Benevolence, or Sister Betsy. What did they do? The challenge was issued for each man and woman to support the clergy, inviting men to contribute 5 to 25 cents a week, and women 2 to 10 cents each week. These funds went to the organized church for the purpose of keeping preachers at work spreading the news. The lesser challenge, the challenge to be able to pay clergy to do the work that God had called them to do. As an innovator and overcomer, James White energetically faced challenges and pushed forward towards solutions. He was so deeply involved in the financial workings and stewardship of the church that some questions started to arise as to whether he was mixing his personal entrepreneur projects too closely with the church projects. And so a committee was established, and everyone was invited to write in descriptions of their interactions with James White. Was he ethical? Was he in keeping with the biblical standards? They did this, and after the committee did its work, committee led by J. N. Andrews, see, he went back to work. They figured it out, and back to work J. N. Andrews went. Attacks and questions were raised, and so James White laid everything out, let the committee look at everything he knew, and for them to do their work. The result was a 155-page book containing the testimonies of 54 individuals stating their satisfaction with the way James dealt with them. No written evidence against James White was offered. However, the questions just pop up again at another time, and so another committee went through a similar process with the same findings. Sometimes when we risk, questions come up. Isn't that another call to do things with clarity, with the ability for people to look at them and to understand and to keep the utmost principles at the forefront so that we can answer the questions when they're asked? All these stories are true and accurate, but there is another side to this talented man. He often overworked, and I can see that as true before I even got to those accounts that I found as I read and researched him, because he accomplished so much. Entrusted with so many talents, he energetically employed them for the good of the church, but often to the detriment of himself and to his family. Stories of overwork and exhaustion were not isolated when it came to James White. Many of the early church leaders had to head out to the sanitarium. Groups of broken church leaders caravan to medical establishments for recovery and healing, James White among them. His example brings a challenge to invest heavily in God's work and to do it wisely and carefully with balance. Same time, to achieve a balance that is difficult to have. We must work hard. It is part of the calling, and yet it is the rest that rejuvenates. Total stewardship is one of time, talents, and resources, and includes hard work as well as time to recover. Because the principles are there in the Bible. In Nehemiah 9, it says these words, "You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their hosts, the earth and everything on it, the seas and all that is in them." In Nehemiah 9, everything we have belongs to Him already. Stewardship calls us to deal with them appropriately, to use them. Christians have nothing that belongs to them. I have nothing that belongs to me. I am simply a steward, a manager of what God has given to me to take care of. We are all in that same boat together. This ownership is from the creation of the world. God created, therefore it is his. He has ownership of everything that was made by the voice that he spoke and by the work of his hand. Genesis 1 describes a God who created from absolutely nothing. Isn't that amazing? He started from nothing and created it. There's this joke that goes about that. We often make light of the fact that God created because we have immersed ourselves in it and we are aware that he has created. But when we realize that it was formless and void before his voice was heard on the face of the deep, can you imagine something that could come out of nothing merely by the spoken word? We can create things with our hand out of clay. We can create things out of yarn. We can create things out of wood and glass. But none of it is alive. But God does not have the limitations we have. From nothing he created, and therefore all is his. God claims ownership of everything in this world, from humans to growing things to possessions. And as the owner, God has the authority to assign its care to whomever he chooses. We could go around in our house and put labels on everything that said belongs to God, belongs to God, belongs to God. From the refrigerator to the car to the jacket we put on when it's cool. It all belongs to God. Being aware of the source of resources gives us an understanding of how things should be treated. The source dictates the care of these resources as well as their sharing. A look in the passage in Luke 12:15 gives a case study in this principle. This is how it goes. And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." God has entrusted you with things, but you are not labeled or esteemed or looked down upon based off of what you possess. What follows is the parable told by Jesus of a wealthy man who didn't recognize where his wealth came from. And it never says there's a problem with wealth, because there are those who have wealth and those who have little. But it is recognizing where it comes from, because in this story in Luke, there's a man who has so much that comes in from his harvest. He says, "Look what I have done. I will build more barns and I will take care of my resources." Do you recognize the challenge? I, instead of recognizing the source of the things that he had. Recognizing where those blessings originate puts possessions in the right perspective. A perspective is reached where these possessions become tools to further his mission, not to hoard for our own selfish purposes. Because of this understanding, the one entrusted with the resources will be willing to employ them for God's work rather than to enrich our own lives. When this word stewardship is used, management, sometimes when I stand up before my church and I say, "And now let's talk about stewardship," I see people bracing, saying, "You're going to talk about my money and try to pry my fingers off of it." I'm the preacher, but that's not my job, because what their fingers are holding on to belongs to God. I can trust him to open their fingers and make the work possible. It's what we are called to do. Looking at Malachi 3, verses 7 through 8, it says it very pointedly. "Yet from the days of your fathers you have gone away from my ordinances and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you said, 'In what way shall we return? Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me.' But you say, 'In what way have we robbed you?' In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation." It's very direct. Tithes and offerings are a sign of loyalty to God and acceptance of his leadership. Yet stewardship extends so much further than the small percentage placed in an envelope and turned over to our church in order to further that work. Stewardship includes caring for our gifts and abilities, as described in 1 Peter 4, verse 10. "As each one has received a gift, minister to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 3 supports this by saying that the Christian is responsible for the knowledge of God that they have, and in turn they have the responsibility to share with others. What you have belongs to God. He is calling you to make the decisions about its use with him involved, because he is the one who entrusts you with it. Experiments in stewardship. Donate 5 things. Do you think you could walk through your house and find 5 things that you do not need any longer? 5 things that you could give away. This would be the first experiment in stewardship I would invite you to do. When you get home, go and find 5 things. Look at something that you're no longer using that could bless someone else. This is the goal in giving 5 things. Looking at your possessions in this light. Try this. Walk through your house and look at things. Which things that you need to live? Which are things that are fulfilling a want? And which could you share? Looking at our possessions in this light may fill your heart with gratitude and thanks. Walking along and looking at everything God has blessed you with, recognizing the blessings that you have. And in that spirit, walk through your house again and choose 5 items to donate. Choose 5 things you can share with someone else. Pick them up quickly. Don't think too long. Just follow the prompting that says this one, and put it in a box, and don't look at it again until you're there to give it away. We have a sharing box in my house, and periodically we go through the house and choose what we can share. The quicker I get the sharing box out of the house, the more likely we are to actually share it. Enough said. What I found the most effective is when I'm already out running an errand that I just run past the donation center where I can drop it off. How about taking it a step further? When you receive a gift, find something you can share. So often we just keep bringing things into our house and the seams of the house get smaller and smaller. When we receive, go ahead and share. Find something to give. By sharing items left untouched for several days, our hearts are required to think about others instead of saying that it is all mine. We can understand and accept that it belongs to God, that it truly is Him who gave it to us. How about returning what you have, returning tithes and offerings first? That should be an easy one, right? Is this something that goes without saying, or do we need to say it? I've noticed in my time as a pastor that we truly do need to put this on the list of experiments in stewardship. Because often we will say, it's on my budget, I will get to it. But if it is what we do first, it is more likely to happen. So what happens in my family is that we use online giving because it is convenient to us. So as soon as we get the notification that says the direct deposit has come in from our paychecks, we jump over to the church website, we decide what we're going to give in tithes and offerings, give it immediately. We've done it first. Choose to place God first. If you write checks, immediately write that check and send it off to your church to support the work there. Whatever method you choose, some choose to withdraw their money in cash and make sure they're ready to place it in the offering plate. The Bible invites us to be good stewards. We are invited to return 10% of our income to God as tithe, and then above that to choose at our own discretion what our tithes and offerings will be. If tithes and offerings are currently a part of your lifestyle, this will be an easy step because you're just changing the order and not instituting a whole new habit. If tithes and offerings are new to you, this will take a family meeting for you to talk together. Because while there's usually one person in the family who is the primary on where the dollars and the finances will go, the whole family should be involved in that decision, even letting children know that this is something we choose to do and helping them to understand why we choose to do it. By returning God's portion first, it says that He is most important. It also removes the temptation to choose to keep God's part when the balance in the checking account shrinks. And paying bills and purchasing groceries and the clothing for our children's back shrinks the dollar figure even further. It becomes easy to start rationalizing and saying, well, I'll just catch up next week. And now we go back to Malachi, and it becomes harder and harder to get ahead. You see, I remember the huge transition from full-time work to student labor when I returned to get my master's degree. From a balanced budget without allotments for savings and discretionary income, I went to living off of $804 a month with a written payment of $350 a month. You can start picturing what my life looked like to cover utilities, a car payment, food, and purchasing new warm winter gear as I made the transition from Texas to Michigan. The temptation came to shorten God's peace because on paper it just didn't work, and so there were times I gave into that temptation. If I had given it first, it would have removed it. However, the month that I took courage and challenged God to stretch my dollars because I was going to do it first, strange things started happening. I remember a tube of toothpaste that just wouldn't run out. I remember milk that was great, well beyond the point that it should have been. And they may seem like small miracles, but to me it said that God cared and that I was doing what he was calling me to do, and he honored the decisions that I made. We are invited to do the same. All these little things with no explanation except God's blessings. As you put God first in your finances, see what he will do for you. Step up into this calling to be a steward of your time, talents, and financial resources. Dare to risk returning to God first and see what he will do in response to your faithfulness. Trust your God. I invite you, as another experiment in stewardship, volunteer at a shelter. This is a stewardship of your time. You only have 24 hours in a day. Dedicate some of it to serving at a shelter. I had a young adult small group at one of my churches, and we chose to be on the rotation to go and volunteer at the shelter. And when we went and we served and we made a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread, and we served it to these people that were in the shelter because they needed that care, we were more blessed than they were, because when I went home and I looked around my house, I saw many things that I was blessed with, rather than before I saw a list of things that I needed to receive. It changes our perspective when we realize that there are others who have less and are still happy and content, and recognize that God is still with them even in that difficult place. How about hosting a birthday party? Not for your child, not for you. There are women's shelters who have a monthly birthday party for the children that are there with their mothers. If you can connect with your church, they probably will not let you go in person because they're protecting these mothers with their children who have fled difficult situations. But they will often let you they will give you kind of some description of the toys or the clothing, the things that you could buy. You can take the cake and deliver it, and then it is time just to release and know that the shopping was where you were blessed, and now you are releasing it to be a blessing to others. They often host just a monthly birthday party, not for the children on their day, but on the month of their birthday they can celebrate. And churches can help make that birthday party happen. How about using your talent? Everybody has at least one talent given to them by God. What can you do to use your talent, to use it to build up the work of the church? And we need to invest our time and abilities in building up God's work. It's easy when we talk about stewardship to just look at finances, and that's painful enough. But then God goes on to say, I don't just want that small percentage, I want all of you. I want your time and your talent. So take a prayerful moment to take stock of what God has entrusted you with. Do you delight in making biblical truths simple and telling the story of Jonah? Then maybe you should apply to work in your children's ministry. And most children's ministries are going to ask you to take a couple minutes to fill out some paperwork, to do a background check and take some training because they want to take care of the kids. It's not to make your life difficult in volunteering, it is to protect the children, and it is worth doing. These are hurdles that are necessary, and they are thankful for the work that you do to make it possible. What about joining the Vacation Bible School team? What about looking, if you have a warm smile and a handshake, what about the greeter team in your church? Or to be part of the team that helps people know where to park when they come to your church, so they won't have to guess if there's a reserved spot or where they should be. If you find it difficult to identify your talent, think about asking your pastor for a spiritual gifts inventory. Some of you may have done one before, and it's worth looking at again. 1 Corinthians has a list of the spiritual gifts, and going through this simple inventory that your pastor can help you find will help you know where to go to work. Because when we serve inside of our talents and gifts, we find them energizing and we feel like we fit rather than it being difficult and painful. These hosts of gifts that are given by God are for building up of the church. Some gifts are quiet. If you're a more behind the scenes person, think about how many different things have to happen on a Sabbath morning or a prayer meeting evening or an outreach event to make it happen. There has to be a face up front, but somebody needs to take care of all the details behind the scenes. There is a place for you. If you have a gift and the courage to stand up and read a scripture or to pray, there is a place for that. If you have a place to lead as a Bible worker, to knock on a door and say, welcome to the community, this is who I am, this is my church, we're glad you're here, that takes a whole new kind of courage. If you were here this morning, there was a story of a couple who were out at the mall offering to purchase food for people, and a lady who took them up on that offer, and they turned that into a spiritual conversation. One of the gentlemen in the pictures of that experience, he has this amazing ability. He could walk up to anyone and turn it into an offer for Bible studies. That's a gift. We need those gifts as well. The goal, to find a way to be active instead of sitting quietly during your devotional time. Not only will it encourage you to be able to use those gifts, what will build up the work of the church and give you encouragement as you walk with God. This is a rewarding way to live life, recognizing that it all begins to God. The challenge to step out in faith and put God first. I invite you to keep that handout on stewardship and go with me to meet a new personality. Have you read Isaiah 58, verses 13 through 14 before? It says, if you call my Sabbath a delight. And this brings us to the idea of worship. We as Seventh-day Adventists speak of worship lovingly, most often in context of the seventh-day Sabbath. It's coming soon. It's only a few hours away, and that's why I wanted to talk about this topic today, because we prepare for what we will experience tomorrow. And the personality I introduce you to is a man by the name of J.N. Andrews, John Nevin Andrews. You heard him mentioned in the story with James White because James White helped him return to ministry, and he was one of those talented ones who were leaving ministry because they just couldn't make ends meet. This young man, his career path was set. At a very young age, John Nevin Andrews would become a lawyer. You see, Uncle Charlie, a member of Congress, graciously volunteered to fund the education required to reach this goal. But Andrews' life changed drastically when he read a tract by T.M. Preble proclaiming the Sabbath. John accepted this experience as his own, the idea of a Sabbath day, and committed his life to furthering the message. This life-altering change from lawyer to preacher came about at the ripe young age of 15. Let me give you a few details on his accomplishments. Looking at his accomplishments, you can well see why his uncle coveted him as a partner in his law firm. But God called him to serve the young Seventh-day Adventist church as its foremost scholar. As an adult, he could read the Bible in 7 languages. He reportedly could reproduce the New Testament from memory. Andrew's first official church leadership post started at the age of 21, serving as a traveling minister in New England. Within 5 years, he was utterly prostrated because of intense study and a heavy program of writing and public speaking. Having lost his voice and injured his eyesight, he went to Waco, Iowa, where with his parents' help and working in their store as a clerk, he sought to regain his health. And with its energy, to be able to return to his work if he could figure out how financially to do this. He broke himself because he was working full-time as a pastor and a full-time to make money to support his family. And this is where these two personalities cross. James White went to work with the church structure to find out how to support pastors and their families so that they could do the work of God. Many of you may remember him for his status as the Adventist Church's first official missionary. Now, I must say first official church missionary because there was actually a missionary in Switzerland, in that area, before J.N. Andrews was there. But he wasn't official. You see, he went to the General Conference leadership, said, "Please send me as a missionary." To which they responded, "We are going to send a missionary, but that's not the role we would like you to be in." To which this recent convert to the Seventh-day Adventist Church returned to his previous denomination, said, "Will you send me as a missionary?" They said yes. He went and started preaching the Seventh-day Adventist message. Now, we'll discuss and consider the ethics of that at a different point. But it motivated the Seventh-day Adventist Church to move quickly on sending missionaries. Because of his scholarship and his ability, he was able to go over to Switzerland and quickly assimilate the language. He felt at home with research and study. He joined James White and Joseph Bates as the publishing head of the Review, and soon after took over as editor. During this time, he studied and researched voraciously. Later, he even served as General Conference president for a short time. So many gifts. The Sabbath conferences in 1855 hosted energetic debate on the manner in which to keep the Sabbath. And Andrews spoke up. Do you know their main point of debate? When does the Sabbath start? Sabbath is coming, so when does the Sabbath start? Okay, for a second you were afraid it was a trick question. You are functioning off of something that this man helped put in place. You see, there was a group that said Sabbath was from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. because the Bible said from evening to evening. And when does the evening start? But at 6 p.m. This was the way that they based it off of, because they were looking at an artificial start and a stop. John Nevins Andrews, during this discussion, stood up and said, evening to evening, from sunset to sunset, was the way that a day was measured when you look in Genesis 1. You can go back and look at it. It describes it. The evening and the morning were the first day, the second day, the third day. And this is what he supported it on. The main topic under discussion. And this is what he said. And this is where the debate went. And they listened to him, and they believed, and they studied and researched, and they said, we agree, from sunset to sunset. And after much prayer, this is what was adopted. And they decided the best way to share this with the larger world church was to write a definitive paper. And it was in order. And James White invited this guy, John Andrews, to write the definitive paper on the start of the Sabbath, putting forward Bible proofs for the sundown start to the Sabbath. And this he did with dedication and fervor. Within this scholar also beat the heart of compassion. John Andrews was interested in the well-being of others. While attending the Wright Camp meeting in Michigan in 1868, he went from tent to tent in the evening asking the question, "Are you all comfortable for the night?" As I drove into your camp, I could picture John Andrews walking around from tent to tent and from RV to RV, saying, "Is all well here?" And if he heard someone say, "No, we need a little more firewood," he would set out and find it, or whatever was needed. He chose to meet that need. When the Civil War arose, questions came about non-combatancy, especially when soldiers were Seventh-day Adventist. How should they relate to it? Should an Adventist soldier carry a weapon? And again, this gentleman stepped up and used his contacts in Congress through his uncle in order to assure Adventist young men could secure non-combatant status for Seventh-day Adventists during the Civil War. Continuing in his study of the Sabbath, John Andrews produced the church's first definitive work on the Sabbath. After much work, he published the monumental and scholarly volume, History of the Sabbath and the First Day of the Week. This book placed before the church the foundation for Sabbath keeping and its history. It also made plain to all those curious about this unique doctrine why we kept the seventh day holy. On page 575 of this book, History of the Sabbath. You can tell he was very thorough. He said, "The Sabbath therefore lies at the very foundation of divine worship, for it teaches this great truth in the most impressive manner, and no other institution does this. The true ground of divine worship, not of that on the seventh day merely, but of all worship, is founded in the distinction between the Creator and his creatures. This great fact can never become obsolete and must never be forgotten." Do you hear the heart of this scholar? He's able to lay out where the change happened. He's able to look at all of the theology and all the nuances of the original language and what it speaks. And what he wants people to remember most when they close his book is it's about God at the heart of it. All the others are important, but when it comes to being what must not be forgotten is that Creator and his creatures and that he cares for us. It was powerful to me as I studied him to see the contribution he gave to the church, as well as what he was willing to do to keep God at the heart of the Sabbath. Not the methods of keeping it, but the focus on the Savior. And as we enter looking at experiments that we can do, we must remember that in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3, it describes God finishing his work, and it says, "On it he rested from all the work which he had created and made." This is the description of the very first Sabbath. The very, very first Sabbath that ever took place in the history of our world. And God set the example by resting and being in connection with his creation. And so as you experience the Sabbath, I invite you as an experiment to first prepare for worship. To expect that when you go into worship, you will meet God there, that your community will be around you, and together you will earnestly seek your Heavenly Father. To prepare for worship also by setting out what you will wear the next day. I have noticed that statistically speaking, on Sabbath morning, it is harder to find socks and shoes than on any other day of the week. So it's like preparing for war at the Cruz household. Everyone sets out every single article of clothing from skin to outer layer that will go on our bodies the next morning, because we know there's going to be hiccups and we don't want it to be the lost shoes and socks. So they are all set out. But I also invite you, as you prepare for worship, that you tune your heart to God so that all those details are taken care of and there can be a hush of the flurry of activities and a few things less to worry about because the decisions are made before. So when you get up on Sabbath morning, you have the expectation of a blessing and being a blessing to others as you gather for worship at your church. I invite you to welcome the Sabbath. As we looked at in the Sabbath conference, they decided, and I agree with them, that Sabbath started at sundown. In my house growing up with Dr. Dad and Master Mom, it was my parents and the 3 kids. They made Friday night very special. I remember a special candelabra that would come out and the candles would be lit and we would be together eating on paper plates. And as a kid, I have to tell you, paper plates were the best thing ever. Can you guess why? Nobody had to do the dishes. We'd have popcorn and fruit, and if we were really sweet to Mom, she would make amazing tapioca pudding. And there we would sit around the table and we would share and we would talk, and my father would teach us these amazing things like orange smiles. You know, if you cut a slice of orange and you bite down on it and your lips wrap around it, you smile and you got the orangest teeth ever. But then he went the next step. He said, if you peel off the skin of the orange and you squeeze it next to the flame, the oil from the orange peel spurts out and it catches fire. And this is why we're talking to a group of adults instead of children. I believe that my mother would have been at peace if my father never taught us that. But I'm very thankful he did. It's part of my memories of welcoming the Sabbath on Friday nights. The week is busy, especially in our household. But on my calendar, it says Sabbath preparations, because I want to have a few moments where I haven't scheduled something in other than welcoming the Sabbath. How about experiencing the Sabbath by taking a hike? When was the last time a preacher said, take a hike? All right, here you go. One just said it to you. It's the opportunity to read God's second book. I believe the Bible is the clearest reading that we can have to understand the clearest revelation of God's character. It's clear, it's theoretical, it is real, it is practical. But when you walk in nature, you see the application of it. You see the creative God who decided to put just that number of petals around that pink flower and to put just that smell in the pine tree as you walk. So I invite you on Sabbath afternoon, take a hike. If your physical fitness allows, hike miles. If you need a slower pace to truly enjoy the Sabbath and not be so exhausted, take a slower hike. But the invitation is to spend time in nature, which we get to do tomorrow because we're at Camp White Sand. This would be an easy thing to do, to experience and take a hike. What about researching the Sabbath? If you're very adventurous, you can get out Jay and Andrew's book. You can read about 600 pages of history of the Sabbath. You might want to start at sundown, and maybe you'll get done by the next sundown. I say it in jest, but it is beautiful to research the Sabbath, to see how it has been kept in the past and how it is kept today. There's this book called The Sabbath by a rabbi, Abraham Heschel. It is fascinating to see a Jewish rabbi's take on the Sabbath. He describes that Israel has not kept the Sabbath, but that the Sabbath has kept Israel. Do you hear the distinction? It is not just something that they have done, but by doing it, their identity has been kept, their relationship with God is strong. I invite you to research the Sabbath. I invite you to worship through service. To worship joyfully as part of the team that makes church happen on Sabbath morning. Worship is a form of keeping the Sabbath. Service. My husband is part of our AV team, and he goes around and takes care of a multitude of details that nobody notices unless he's away for a week. He worships through service, not through stillness. There are many of you who do the same, and if you haven't done it, I invite you to try it. Because there is something about knowing the gifts that you have are being exercised in order to point people to Jesus. So you can spend the Sabbath worshiping through service and be wholly in keeping with that precious commandment that invites us to keep the Sabbath day holy. I know we have just scratched the surface and you've been patient with the tickle in my throat, but I hope what you take from this is a realization that your journey with Jesus is a time and a relationship, and there are many ways to spend time with your Heavenly Father. Every spiritual practice I have shared is one that I have tried out and I have been blessed by, and it is by no means an exhaustive list of what you can do to spend time with your Heavenly Father.
Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.